It's Thursday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster.
The NHS may be broken, but it's not beaten. And we need to have the courage to deliver long-term reform. Major surgery, not sticking plasters.
Following a damning report into the critical state of the NHS in England, can Labour really fix it? The Australian Prime Minister says children are spending too much time on their phones. So is this a good idea?
I know you're worried about the impact social media can have on young children, and so am I. That's why we'll introduce legislation this year for a minimum age for social media.
Also, how should the West deal with dictators?
These dictators and autocrats are rooting for you to be president again because they're so clear. They can manipulate you.
I know Putin very well. I have a good relationship and they respect your president, okay? They respect me.
And one of the sub-postmasters who inspired the TV drama about the long-running post office scandal said this at an awards ceremony last night.
I went to Westminster a couple of weeks back and saw the new minister, and trust me, nothing has changed.
Joining us today, Labour MP Jivun Sanda, Conservative MP and Shadow Northern Ireland Secretary Alex Burkhart, Daily Mirror columnist Susie Boniface and LBC radio presenter Ian Dale. This is Politics Live. Let's pick up on what you just heard the former sub-postmistress Jo Hamilton say in the headlines there at an awards ceremony last night. She said nothing has changed since Labour got into government. Now, it took a TV drama to push this scandal right to the forefront of political and public debate. It did spur on the last Conservative government to speed up action in terms of compensation, and Labour has promised that justice and compensation would be delivered swiftly in that manifesto. But, starting with you, Jivun, will the system, the political system, materially change under Labour to prevent scandals like this taking decades to sort?
Well, first, what those postmasters went through was absolutely horrible and horrific. None of us, I think, have been failed to be moved by it. Look, this particular compensation scheme they were discussing, there was a £75,000 payment up front from the last government. We do recognise that in some cases people will want more. One of the first things the minister did was to meet with the postmasters.
And she said nothing's changed.
Well, we're saying in the future that within the next 40 days, 90% of offers will be made. There's a huge list of things that we have to fix. This is one of them, and absolutely we want to see them get the compensation they need and indeed deserve.
But will things materially change? Do they need to change materially? And we can look at all sorts of scandals. It could be the contaminated blood scandal, it could be Grenfell, Windrush, Post Office. You can pick whichever one. Will anything change?
So I think what you're seeing in what started out as the Conservative response to the Post Office scandal, people now receiving money. It's very important that as many people as get the money that they deserve as quickly as possible. I think that's a challenge for the new government. We'll be watching very closely to see whether they get those payments. On infected blood, one of the last things that the Conservatives did in power was set out exactly what our response was going to be, that people were going to get compensation, and that got cross-party support. So I'm very hopeful that that will come into play. I think there is a danger, general risk with very big public inquiries, that they can take too long, and in doing so, people feel that they're being delayed access to justice and things run into the sand. And I do think that that's something every government has to be very, very mindful of when they're setting up that process.
Will the political system materially change?
No, there's only one way that it will, and that's to have some prosecutions when things go really seriously wrong. So yesterday I was in Parliament with nuclear veterans, which was another scandal that you could list along with all the others. And one of the fundamental problems is that although the politicians, new ministers and so on have met them and are supportive of their case, the fundamental problem is that the officials who run the departments, who have been saying for many years, as they did with Grenfell, as they did with Windrush, as they did with Orgreave, for example, that nothing was amiss, are the same officials now. And politicians have this conceit that when they are elected and when they start saying stuff, that will change things. It doesn't. The system and the machinery needs to change. And the only way you do that is if you penalise the machinery when it gets something wrong and grinds people to dust. And that means prosecutions for things like misconduct in public office. It means real, proper, effective, rapid public inquiries, not ones that take 10 years, and to have police investigations that run alongside them concurrently, not consecutive, so that you don't have to wait a long time for justice.
Just before I come to you, Ian, do you agree with that?
I think, well, with grandfather are going to be prosecutions to come, and more broadly, it is a matter for the CPS. It's certainly not for me as a politician to direct prosecutions. We agree that is far too long while having a grandfather. I don't think anyone I think everyone feels that way, including the Prime Minister, as we all saw in his statement. So yes, it has taken far too long. Again, there's a huge amount for us to fix, but of course, it's not proper for me as a politician to direct prosecutions.
In terms of the system itself, responding to what Susie was saying, it won't change unless you make some really distinct and quite dramatic changes in terms of pursuit, perhaps, of justice.
Well, I think Labour hit the ground running in so many ways when they first came into power and showed that the whole mantra of change, they did intend to bring it about. Now, we're still only, 2-3 months in? Of course. However, the change rhetoric is just rhetoric at the moment. And I think in areas like the post office, this is why you need strong ministers. And if you come into government with no experience of being a minister, inevitably you are kind of taken hostage by your civil servants if you do not direct them. And I think for Jo Hamilton to appear on that stage last night and say that, and she said quite a lot of other things as well, indeed that Alan Bates has only been offered 30% of his claim, I think anybody watching that will have been completely horrified. That's why you need a strong minister. I don't even know who the Post Office Minister is, but I think it comes under Johnny Reynolds. And if I was Johnny Reynolds this morning, I would be asking my Post Office Minister how that's been allowed to happen.
I think Justin Madders is the minister that Jo Hamilton has met. Correct me if I'm wrong, Jivan. But let's move on to the review on the state of the NHS in England, because that is the big story this morning. The report that was commissioned by the government, I think it's taken 9 weeks. It's been extremely quick. It did it shortly after it came to power, the government in July. It's been carried out by the independent peer, NHS surgeon and former government health minister under Gordon Brown, Lord Darzi. Let's have a look at some of today's front pages, starting with the Daily Telegraph. NHS does less despite record funding. If you have a look at the front page of the Mirror, it says a decade to fix our broken NHS. You'll have heard Keir Starmer talking about a decade of renewal. And The Times is Labour orders biggest NHS reform in history. Now, the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, has been speaking, giving his response to that report. Let's have a listen to what he had to say, or part of it.
So the problem isn't that the NHS is the wrong model. It's the right model. It's just not taking advantage of the opportunities in front of it. And that's what we need to change. Reform does not mean just putting more money in. Now, of course, even in difficult financial circumstances, a Labour government will always make the investment in our NHS that is needed, always. But we have to fix the plumbing before turning on the taps. So hear me when I say this. No more money without reform. As Lord Darzi has said, NHS staff are working harder than ever, but productivity has fallen.
Keir Starmer there. Let's talk to Dr Bex Fisher, Director of Research and Policy at the health think tank, the Nuffield Trust. Welcome to you. First of all, your reaction to the report.
I think they've done an incredible job in 9 weeks, but it makes for really grim reading, doesn't it? I also don't think that this will come as a surprise to many people, really. I think those of us who work in the NHS, those of us who experience it, many of us, and those of us who study it have known for a long time that these problems exist. I think what Lord Darzi's report does, though, is put the whole picture together, and that's what makes it particularly grim but also valuable and interesting. So, for example, you see the intersection between austerity, between really constrained funding for the NHS over the past decade, and the Health and Social Care Act, which, as Darzi points out, had really dreadful consequences for the NHS. One thing I do just want to highlight, though, is that this is absolutely not a complete diagnosis. So the terms of reference for this report didn't include a comprehensive look at public health and social care. The reason why that matters so much is because those services are on their knees and they intersect very closely with the NHS. So if we set about building a plan to fix the NHS on the basis of this report alone, it won't work, because we also need to look at how we fix public health and how we fix social care.
One of the things that the government, Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary, and the Prime Minister have said repeatedly is that there should be no more money for the NHS without reform. Do you agree with that?
I think the key bit there is the end of the sentence. I think if you said no more money, I think that's unrealistic. At the Nuffield Trust, we calculate that the NHS will have a deficit of over £4 billion at the end of this year alone. So the NHS is going to need more money, but I do think it's fair. Well, with or without reform, but I do think it's fair to say that we can do better with the money that we're getting as well. I think, though, that there are things that government can do to help get more value for money. One of those is put it in different places. Historically, we've been spending lots and lots of money on the hospital and acute sector, but the proportion of NHS money that goes to community and primary care, that's things like general practice NHS dentistry, is at a record low. So spend it in different places, but also help the NHS out by giving us longer-term funding settlements. For too many years now, really since Brexit, we've had these short 1 or 2 year financial settlements for the NHS for things like capital spending. And that means that you can be less efficient with the money that you have.
Do we spend overall less or more to comparable countries when it comes to healthcare?
So I'm going to caveat this answer slightly because, of course, international comparisons are difficult sometimes because countries count different things in different ways and bring bits of care into healthcare. So there's a caveat to begin with, but broadly speaking, we are low to middle of the pack compared to other peer countries. So if you look at 14 EU health systems that also have public health systems, much like we do, 9 of those 14 spend more than we do, and 6 of those spend over 20% more. So I definitely would push back against the assertion that we're spending more than other healthcare systems. We're absolutely not.
Stay with us, Bex. Jeevan, you heard what Bex Fisher has said in terms of funding. Do you agree that there should be no more funding over and above than what's been committed unless and until there is reform in the NHS?
We're going to reform and provide, of course, the funding to ensure that everybody gets the treatment that they need. Look, we all know how bad the NHS is at the moment. We know that waiting lists doubled between 2010 and 2019, doubled again. 14,000 people are dying every year because they can't get the A&E treatment they need. That's 14,000 funerals. So to get our NHS working for all of our loved ones, we need to reform it and rebuild it at the same time. And as you've heard the Prime Minister set out, as well as Wes Streeting this morning, reform, more focus on prevention, more focus on community care and greater digital use so we can use everything, every pound we put in more efficiently.
Right, but that's going to need more money up front, isn't it? It may save more in the long term, but it's going to need more investment up front to go from analogue to digital, to have prevention for things like obesity and type 2 diabetes, and to move from hospitals to communities.
Investment can't come without the reform that we need, because as we've heard, we're not spending those pounds efficiently. Now, we could chuck more money down this system, and by the way, we are also hiring 1,000 more GPs, but at the same time, there does need to be reform, and everyone watching today wants every single pound to go as far as it can to help treat our loved ones.
Right, is anything, again, going to change? It's going to be the same old mantra that we've heard from successive governments about reform. We're putting in lots of extra money into the NHS and the outcomes are getting worse.
Hold on, Jo, I don't think that's really fair, though, right? Because the last Labour government got down waiting lists to record low. The last Labour government left us with an NHS that had record high satisfactions, the envy of the world. So the last time we were in government, absolutely, we reformed our NHS and built an NHS that we were all proud of. And for everyone at home,
hang on, all right.
It meant being able to get a GP appointment on the same day.
But the last big reforms, sorry, Alex, the last big reforms the NHS had under the Conservatives, the Lansley reforms, cost multiples of billions and, according to this report, helped destroy the NHS and get it to the basket case that it is now. What everyone at home wants to know is what those reforms actually are in practical terms. How are you just going to reshuffle the money and move it somewhere else? Are you going to start stopping doing something or starting doing something else? There's already lots of community care happening at home. There's already an army of carers who are totally unpaid, who are looking after loved ones and saving our NHS thousands and billions of pounds every year. What's actually going to happen?
This word reform, it's a nice word. We all agree it's a positive word. But the problem is that very few people seem to have an idea of what reform actually means. Back in 2010, the Conservative government said we should reform. A lot of people said, yes, there are lots of things wrong with the NHS, let's reform it. Those reforms didn't turn out particularly brilliantly, it has to be said. So I want to hear a bit of meat on the bone. Instead of Keir Starmer uttering this PR guff which he did this morning, talking about we've got to reform. I mean, there's no detail there whatsoever. Now, I'm actually quite positive about it in the sense that I think Wes Streeting actually does have an idea of what to do, but I want to hear more from him in articulating that.
We'll come on to the reform and what it looks like in just a moment, but we have talked about the years of austerity under the coalition government led by David Cameron. Arid Darzi says there was a lost decade under the Conservatives. Do you want to accept that actually the money that was spent, and there was some money spent, but underinvestment on capital, yes, it was, but it was a slowing increase in those years. Do you want to accept responsibility for that Conservative government and the damage that's been done according to the report?
Yeah, what we haven't talked about is why there was a need for austerity. So, look, the Labour, I'll start out by saying I welcome a big conversation about the future of the NHS, and I think we're all going to try and engage with this positively, because we do understand that there needs to be improvement. But with all respect to, Jeevan on my right, the fact is that whilst the Labour government did some good things for the NHS, it also left the public finances in a terrible state that required a long period of reduced increases in spending. But there still were increases. And when we left power earlier this year, real term spending on the NHS was a third higher than when we came to power. There were more people working in the NHS than ever before.
And they are doing less. That's what it says.
Exactly. There is a real need for improved productivity. I think one of the other things that Lord Darzi says is that the health of the nation has gone down, and that this is something that needs to be taken care of. But I think that the point that Ian made is very much to the reality of this, which is you can talk about reform, but unless you actually spell out what you're going to do, it doesn't mean anything. And the truth is that Labour have been in opposition for a very long time. They could easily have done this piece of work that was sort of knocked out in 12 weeks whilst they were in opposition. They could easily have started to set out the sort of reforms they wanted to see to the NHS before the election and given the public a choice. But they chose not to. Now, look, I understand politics. I know that people play politics. But this is completely naked.
First of all, before we got into office, we had what was the most detailed pre-manifesto programme of government this country has ever seen in our mission
NHS
documents. I want to pick up precisely on Ian's points about what reform means. The point is that we are living longer and indeed with more health conditions. And because of that, we need to think about how exactly we're treating those health conditions. When you talk about community care, you're talking about getting care before they get into the GP. I actually met my GP last week, and that's exactly what they were saying to me, that at the moment they're seeing patients too late before problems start to multiply. The old system we used to have when I was young, the 10-minute appointment, is no longer working. That's why we need to get out of the community. Prevention is better than cure. Unfortunately, your government cut that public health budget by 25%. That was a penny-wise but pound-stupid decision that's costing us a lot more in the long run. And the move to digital, of course, is the way we're all going and how every single pound we're spending being used more efficiently.
Well, while you two are arguing about who
I
did
don't want to
what
argue. I want to come back on digital productivity, which I think is a good thing. And in Jeremy Hunt's last budget, he committed £3.5 billion to digital productivity. I was involved in that. I was the AI minister in the Cabinet Office. I think there are huge gains to be made, but do you think that the current Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, should support the use of that £3.5 billion, which he hasn't yet committed to?
You know that I'm a backbencher. I'm very much a junior member of staff in this government, right? In this government. No, we're a team and united team. We don't bicker amongst ourselves. And I trust the Chancellor.
Not yet. Give it time. Give it time.
To make decisions over the budget. I also would say this. I used to work in the Treasury. Anyone could put down amendments for £1 billion. I could sit here on this programme and spend billions upon billions, but she has to make the numbers add up at the end. I absolutely trust Rachel and Keir to make the right decisions, and what she decides is a matter for her, and we'll see it in the budget.
Let me go back to Dr. Bex-Fisher, because I understand you're a GP too, continue to practice. What's your view from the front line? Do GPs need to change the way they practice too?
I think in some ways we of course need to change. in others, we probably need to go back to things that we used to do and revitalise them. So, for example, continuity of care with a GP, the relationship between an individual patient and a GP over time, is associated for large groups of patients with so many benefits. It reduces their hospital admissions, it keeps them well, helps them stay at home, and reduces life expectancy. It's also more productive for the NHS, not for all patients, but for large groups of patients. So actually bringing back things like continuity of care, which are of course linked to the number of GPs we have, that's flatlined since 2015, is really important. But I think there are also things that general practice needs to change and needs support to change. So I've already talked about the slice of the NHS pie, as it were, that goes to general practice being too small. I think that it is. But we also know that there is inequity in the way that funding is distributed between practices. So at the moment, practices in richer areas get more funding than practices in poorer areas. That is clearly perverse. There is more health need in poorer areas, and that will contribute to widening health inequalities, not narrowing them. Some of what needs to change in general practice is in the hands of GP surgeries, GPs and their staff to improve. But actually lots of it is in the hand of government in terms of funding, and also in the hands of local commissioners to support general practice to make the changes that it will need to do to deliver better healthcare.
But I mean, is the government really being honest about the situation? Yes, it's a damning indictment from Arid Darzi, but they want to keep the model as it is, keep the NHS free at the point of use, but not raise taxes to perhaps put into public services. They want to digitise the NHS. Is this really an honest conversation, Susie, about what is happening in the NHS?
Not yet. At the moment, it's the same conversation that Alex quoted there and which was said during the times of austerity, which is that the previous government left a mess, we're fixing it. It's so hackneyed now, we've heard it for so long, it doesn't matter which side is saying it, it doesn't really cut through anymore. The fundamental problem with the NHS is that there are parties who want to say, we've spent more than you, we're doing better than you mucked it up, not us. And no one's actually looking at the things that would actually make a radical and huge difference. Something like, you know, the thing that would help a lot with GP practice, with community care, with emergency admissions, are things like a national care service, which is a massive, radical decision to introduce. It sounds expensive, but once that's in, there's huge economies of scale right across the system, and prices and health outcomes and everything just improve immensely. But that is the kind of radical reform that should be debated, that we could be having an argument about, which Keir Starmer isn't putting up to anybody yet. I hope that at some point the conversation gets to that point. We're not there.
And that's something that government can do. It has the power to do that. Where I mean, Bex was talking about what happens in GPs. I'm having to change GP surgery because my GP of 30 years is retiring. And I think my local surgery where I live, they have the system where you just get allocated to one depending on the appointment time. Now, that's not for government to decide. That's something that can be done within the NHS. There are so many things that can be reformed within the NHS without political interference. But can I just say, finally, one thing? I've had a lot of experience of the NHS over the last few years, particularly in the last few weeks. I've had a gallbladder out. And I have to say, I don't recognise this picture of a totally broken NHS. The care that I've received, not just on this occasion, but over the past few years on other things too, has been absolutely exemplary. I think we do have to be careful not to sort of talk the NHS down, partly because my experience of the nurses and doctors that I encountered was that they're totally committed to their job, and they don't want to keep hearing from politicians that they're all rubbish, because they're not.
Right. Well, personal experience is obviously important.
And we all judge it
and many people have very positive personal experiences, but the waiting lists, those numbers...
It's the points of access to the NHS that are the problem.
Huge. Well,
once you get in.
Well, Bex Fisher, what about the use of private healthcare? Are more people turning to private healthcare?
Yes, they are. Two things are happening. The NHS is buying more private healthcare to use, so to help get through the waiting lists, buying capacity in from the private sector is obviously one option, and that has increased in recent years. And then people as individuals are using private healthcare more as an out-of-pocket expense. And I think our work at Nuffield suggests that actually that's probably not that people really want to be doing it, it's that they're being driven to it really out of desperation because of those long NHS waits. Over 6.3 million people on NHS waiting lists at the moment. And the second thing just to say is that of course drives health inequalities, because some people are more able than others to avail themselves of those opportunities.
Right, I mean, do you think that's going to go up, Jivan?
Well, I can't say what's going to happen in the future, but let's be clear, if there's capacity in the private healthcare system to treat someone's mum or someone's child, absolutely is something we are looking at and are willing to do. It's something we did underneath the last Labour government, of course. As Dr. Bex-Fisher has also aligned to or alluded to there, actually apologies because people can't access it, they feel the need to go to private healthcare. We've seen a huge increase in private healthcare over the past 14 years. Now, an NHS system that is working well is one where people do not feel the need to go to private healthcare. It's not where we are right now. Absolutely, we need to rebuild our NHS, and that's what we were setting out today. Lord Dardy setting out the diagnosis and, of course, the prescription, the treatment in the years to come.
And the NHS is brilliant at acute care, emergency care. Where it's not so brilliant is elective care. I went private for my gallbladder operation because I was told otherwise I wouldn't be able to have it for 18 weeks. Now, I couldn't do that for obvious reasons, and I would have happily had it done on the NHS, but I didn't.
Final word, Dr. Bex-Fisher?
I think there is a risk here that increasing use of the private sector undermines NHS provision. So although in some cases the staff in the private sector are entirely separate from the NHS, actually some of the time those staff are using time that they could otherwise have been spending in the NHS. That won't universally be the case, but we have to acknowledge that there is a risk that as we rely on the private sector and as more individuals use it, that actually we undermine the NHS capacity to deliver care as well.
All right, Dr. Bex-Fisher, thank you very much for joining us. Let me just show you this headline. BBC News: Tories took £5 million from Hester, Frank Hester, a Conservative donor, days before election called. This was after it was revealed and he was accused of making racist comments and dangerous comments about the Labour MP Diane Abbott. Let's get the latest with political correspondent Helen Catt. Helen, what has happened today?
Well, what we've had this week and today are the latest figures for the last quarter's political donations, or quarter two, sorry, political donations from all the political parties. And what has shown up in those records is a further donation of £5 million from Frank Hester. It shows that the Conservative Party accepted it on the 17th of May this year. So that's just, a couple of weeks before the election was called. And it is also 2 months after there was that big row about the comments that The Guardian reported in March that they said he had made back in a meeting to his healthcare company, to staff at a meeting in his healthcare company back in 2019, in which The Guardian said he had said that Diane Abbott, the Labour MP, made him want to hate all black women and should be shot. Now, at the time, he apologised for what he said was making rude comments about Miss Abbott, but he said they had nothing to do with her gender nor colour of her skin. The Tories came under pressure at the time to say they would hand back that donation. They made it pretty clear they wouldn't, even though Rishi Sunak, then Prime Minister, said that the comments were racist and wrong. There has been one further donation since this row blew up in March, again in March, of £150,000, which the Conservatives have not returned. There's now this further donation of £5 million. The Liberal Democrats are saying that the Tories should commit to handing it back. They're challenging each of the leadership contenders to say that they would. The Conservative Party, they've approached for comment. They haven't responded. And we should just say Diane Abbott herself has responded to this. She said she was shocked that the Tories are taking money from Frank Hester when even they admitted his remarks were racist. She said that it demonstrated that they were not serious about opposing racism and that it may also mean they are desperate for money.
Helen Catt, thank you. Alex, should that money be handed back?
If I remember rightly, Rishi Sunak looked into this at the time and decided that obviously these horrible comments shouldn't have been made. That Mr. Hester had showed genuine contrition and had publicly apologised for what he'd said, and that was an end to the matter.
Right, but in your view, is that enough? Should the Conservatives have taken another £5 million?
I think if somebody has apologised and is genuinely sorry, then it's possible to move on.
Alex, yeah, he didn't apologise, right? Because he did not say for the racism, right? He didn't say what I said was racist, which it clearly was, and also, of course, incredibly dangerous rhetoric. So I can accept that people apologise, but he did not apologise for being racist, which is indeed what many people feel offended by. And clearly, of course, completely understandably, Diane does as well. Do you think it was racist?
Yeah, I do. I think what he said was racist. But as I say, my understanding is that Rishi looked into this at the time, came to the view that he had showed genuine contrition, that it was possible to move on.
Is that enough, Ian?
2 points. This donation was accepted because the Conservative Party was and is in dire financial straits. Okay. That is the simple reason why it was accepted. Now, but let's not have any sort of holier-than-thou stuff from the Lib Dems. Do we all remember Michael Brown?
Yes.
That dodgy businessman back in 2005 donated £2 million to the Liberal Democrats. Did they hand that back when he was proved to be completely dodgy? No, they didn't. Every political party has these kinds of donations, and it's just stupid to play politics.
It shows more than anything else the Tories had run out of finances and friends, and they had no choice but to take it out to fight a general election, provide resources to candidates.
If you look at what they spent in the general election, it was a fraction of what Labour spent, and that is an indication that they needed to save money because they knew they were going to be in opposition.
All right, let's leave it there. Ian, you have written a new book on dictators through the ages, starting 67. Dictators written about by 64 different writers, including politicians and historians. What inspired you to write the book?
Well, we seem to live in the age of the dictator, don't we? We thought that the 20th century was the age of these massive dictators like Hitler, Mao, Stalin. And yet 70% of the world's population in 52 different countries now lives under a dictatorship. Now you can...
Well, how do you define... How are you sort of broadly defining?
That is the really difficult thing to do because, for example, Lee Kuan Yew is often described as a dictator from Singapore, but he didn't have death camps, he didn't have secret police, he just had a fairly authoritarian society. But I've included him anyway because I think he's an interesting character.
It's rather dictatorial,
I'm the editor of the book, I can do what I like. But it is fascinating, and there's a fantastic essay at the beginning on the psychology of dictators by Professor Ian Robertson from Trinity College Dublin, where he talks about what makes a dictator. And a page of the essay is all about Donald Trump, which I think you're going to come on to now.
Right, well, we may do in just a moment. Are you going to read it, Susie? Are you interested in Dictators Through the Ages?
Not necessarily going to read 64 of them, I'll be honest.
One of them is even a woman.
Well, I'm looking forward to being invited back in Politics Live to puff my book when I publish it later this year about Britain's longest-running scandal.
Right, yes. Just this week in the US, as you quite rightly mentioned, obviously, we watched the debate between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, and there were plenty of spats. One of them was about who would be best placed to stand up to dictators and strong men, as I think Kamala Harris says. Let's have a listen.
It is well known that he admires dictators, wants to be a dictator on day one, according to himself. It is absolutely well known that these dictators and autocrats are rooting for you to be president again because they're so clear. They can manipulate you with flattery and favors.
Viktor Orban, one of the most respected men, they call him a strong man. He's a tough person, smart. Prime Minister of Hungary. They said, why is the whole world blowing up? 3 years ago it wasn't. Why is it blowing up? He said, because you need Trump back as president.
I don't know what you learnt from the book in terms of how to deal with dictators. Let's talk about Vladimir Putin rather than Viktor Orban, who Donald Trump was talking about then. But there has been plenty of discussion about whether the West allowed Vladimir Putin, when he annexed and invaded Crimea, whether action should have been taken then rather than now.
Well, the lesson is, if you don't stand up to a dictator from the start, be very afraid. And that's what we've seen with Putin, because in 2008 with Georgia, the West didn't stand up to him. Certainly in 2014, we saw what the result of not standing up to him was with Crimea. And you go back in history and there are so many examples of where dictators could have been stopped, including Hitler in the 1930s.
But is that with hindsight? It's always easier to say after the event. Let's just show our guests and viewers this headline in the Standard. Keir Starmer heads to Washington to speak to Joe Biden as Ukraine issues long-range missiles plea. Yes, this is about permission Volodymyr Zelensky would like in order to use missiles from the US and Britain to fire deep into Russia. Should he get that permission?
Look, the truth is I don't know, because I don't have access to all of the intelligence that the leaders have. These very sensitive cases where you're talking about escalating a conflict with a major nuclear power, I'm prepared to defer to the people who have the inside information. My personal view, based on the information that I have, is that given the way that Putin's behaved, the gloves are off. And if it's going to further Ukraine's war aims to use those weapons in that way, then I would support Ukraine. But going back to the general point you were making about dictators with Ian, to plug one of Ian's other books, I wrote...
What's going on? We're only doing one.
I wrote an essay for him, his book on kings and queens. I wrote about Alfred the Great, who wasn't a dictator. But it was very much understood in early medieval times that strength breeds peace. Weakness gives you war. That if you present yourself as a strong power, you are much less likely to get attacked. And
what was the slogan of NATO in the 1980s? Peace through strength.
Absolutely. And so if actually what happened, I think in retrospect, we can see that what happened with Crimea, and indeed to a certain extent what happened with the invasion of eastern Ukraine, was that Putin thought that the West was weak. And you could see how his advisors drew the dots and said, they're out of Afghanistan, they let us do what we want in Libya, they let us do what we want in Syria, they're not going to stop us now.
Right.
Terrible miscalculation.
But wars don't always bring peace in that sense.
It's not about wars bringing peace.
But in terms of being strong, do you agree with that, Jeevan, that strength brings peace?
I think that's what the great kind of benefit of the NATO alliance has been, and actually in some sense you don't really recognise how lucky we are. We lived in a nation or an era of peace, no Great War conflict since 1945, something we hadn't had for thousands of years prior to that moment. So actually being part of that NATO alliance is incredibly important. It does keep us safe here at home, and it's something we have to work on. It's good to see that this time we do actually have quite a lot of cross-party support. We always spend a lot of time talking about the things we disagree on. We both agree, I think it's fair to say, that NATO is the guarantor of our security, and agree that we have to guarantee Ukraine's safety to ensure there's safety in Europe in the future.
But this is going to be a big decision, isn't it, Susie, as to whether the UK and the US do somehow say to Volodymyr Zelensky, you can use those missiles and fire into Russia, despite what Vladimir Putin himself has said and warned NATO about.
Yeah, because it's about escalation when it gets to that point, and it's a sticky wicket, to be honest. I'm glad I'm not the one batting it. But the idea of strength, I mean, this is what Donald Trump was talking about, strong man in Hungary, and that dictators are strong men. No, they're not. They are bonkers. And they've usually got a great fatal weakness somewhere. Strength often comes, most should come, from moral certainty. And if our nation and our way of life is to have any purpose, and standing up to those dictators comes from, that is that strength, is saying, no, you can't do this. And that should have happened with Putin in Crimea earlier on. But, you know, we have too much realpolitik. Kamala Harris, if she gets into the White House, is also going to be talking to Putin. She'll be saying different stuff, but Keir Starmer's going to talk to Trump the same way he would Kamala Harris. They're all going to have to communicate with each other because that's the world we're in.
Just briefly, is it seen through sort of Western eyes in that sense? Do we risk always looking at these sorts of issues through a Western prism?
I think that is a good point, because we automatically think that our system of democracy is the best one.
Yeah.
And I think it is true that no one's invented a better one yet. That doesn't mean to say there isn't one. But what you said, Susie, about dictators are universally bonkers, some of them are. You look at Papa Doc Duvalier in Haiti, for example, and there are plenty of other examples. But many of them are absolutely really intelligent people. Now, as they...
Doesn't mean they're not bonkers.
No, that's true.
As they accrue power, it tends to send them bonkers. That is true.
Well, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts completely.
Use their intelligence sometimes. I mean, not all dictators are universally evil. There are some dictators who actually do some good things, as well as some absolutely terrible ones as well.
Let's break with this and listen to this.
This one is for the mums and dads. I know you're worried about the impact social media can have on young children, and so am I. That's why we'll introduce legislation this year for a minimum age for social media. I want kids to have a childhood. I want them off their devices and onto the footy field and onto the netball courts. I want them to have real experiences with real people. Together, we can get this done.
Alex, the Australian Prime Minister there, Anthony Albanese, announcing that they are going to restrict children from accessing social media before their next election. Should the UK follow suit?
Yeah, I really think we should, actually. And I've been following this. I have young children. A lot of my friends have young children. Looked at the work that Jonathan Haidt's done, and there is now very compelling evidence that one of the reasons we're seeing a collapse in mental health amongst young people all over the West is because of access to smartphones, not mobile phones, smartphones. And that coupled with a very risk-averse culture, which is preventing children from seeking independence early and playing outside, I think we're catching up with the fact that we got things wrong over a decade ago with this new technology, and it's time to put it right. A very good campaign being run by Sophie Winkleman, the actor who's in Peep Show, who's promoting this. I think there's an opportunity for cross-party work on it, but I really think that this is a challenge that we need to get a grip on.
Jeevan, would you like to see legislation on this?
We're open to it at the moment. Alex is right, that the 25% rise of mental disorders amongst particularly young women. We've seen the suicides as well. There is a trade-off between discovery and danger. It's so much harder to be a young person today. We are going to build on the Online Safety Act, and we'll see where the evidence gets us to at the end of it.
What sort of legislation would you like to see, if any? Ian?
This is a heart and head thing, in that my heart says, yes, ban anybody under the age of 25 from using social media. 25. But my head says, how on earth do you do that practically?
Wow.
There's no point in bringing in a law that won't work. So I'm very interested to see what the Australians do. I don't think we should rush into this. I think there are all sorts of questions about children's mental health, as Alex says. And if I had children, I would certainly not want them to be using social media, but certainly before 14. But then again, would I want them to have sex education before 14? My heart says no, but my head says, of course you have to.
What would you do, Susie?
Well, I've got an 8-year-old, so I'm who's nicks my phone and is emojiing people, so I'm going to have to think about it. But I mean, at the turn of the previous century, when they first discovered radiation, they treated that as to start with, they sold it as a quack medical cure, until they realised that it was quite lethal, plutonium, and you didn't want to be injecting it into yourself. We did it with smoking and lots of other things. Something's come along, everyone's loved it, and then when it gets banned, someone says, well, how are you going to stop children getting their hand on cigarettes? You can find ways around it, but I think what you can do is if Australia and Britain and other big markets for mobile phones can legislate against certain things, then you can find a way that the tech companies are encouraged to produce phones which can be, for example, daughter phones of a parent's phone, where some apps cannot be downloaded and cannot be used, where cameras can't be used for some things, which can be safe, which you can market as a smarter phone. And those companies realise there's a multi-billion-dollar market there from parents like us who go, yeah, do you know what? I'll buy a lovely bright Barbie pink one of those for my little girl. Right, Jeevan, what do you mean when you say you're open-minded? What would you like to see? Would you like to see a social media ban for under 16s?
Well, I want to see what the evidence comes out of it. I think Ian is right, by the way. Like we will have like a trial going on in other nations, but I want to see what the evidence is, because there is a trade-off between discovery and danger. Like, you know, we were all young once, I think increasingly a long time ago. I'm certainly getting more grades. But back when I was... But when I was young, you know, you wanted to experience and see the world as it was. And actually, you got to learn about the world. I was in the age just as the internet was coming up. I think I knew a lot more about politics because of that. There are also other things where you are learning and interacting on social media. So there is a trade-off here. I think we're very much open to it, though, given the harms that we're seeing amongst children and young people today.
Right, but is it achievable?
Yeah, of course it's achievable. It's technology. And yeah, and there'll be some people who get round it and rest of it, but you mustn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And I just, you know, the other day I was at a friend's house and she's got a teenage daughter, and I went into their living room and I was really shocked because there were 8 teenage girls in there. I had no idea there'd been anyone in the room because they were completely silent. They were all on their phones, not talking to each other. There was something in me that I just thought this.
It's like watching Prime Minister's Questions, isn't it? They're all sat there on their phones.
But you can't regulate that. There have been very few successful attempts at regulating the internet. So unless somebody's got a bright idea of how it can work,
you market it. You make it more attractive to children. You get a better phone than the one Mum and Dad's got. He's got a boring phone he doesn't work on. Well, you can do something better
on that because I'm addicted to my phone as well. But I am over the age of 16. Now, the House rises today for conference season. The Lib Dems head to Brighton this weekend. There have been some conferences already and will be there on Tuesday to cover Ed Davey's speech. Then Politics Live will be in Liverpool for Labour and in Birmingham for the Conservatives in the following weeks. Make sure you join me on Monday. Bye-bye.